Hey guys, and welcome to the channel. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can improve your stamina and endurance. And maybe I can get you to consider why no pain, no gain isn't really the best way to approach endurance training. Oftentimes, it's not about who works the hardest in endurance training. It's more about who works the smartest. And in the end of the video, you'll understand why often your fast is too slow and your slow is too fast. So before we get into the specifics of endurance training, I want to quickly talk about what is endurance. So in general, it's just about that we as individuals want to be able to endure a certain activity for longer periods of times. And endurance is mostly influenced by heart rate, lactate threshold, ventilation, and oxygen consumption. But now the question comes up about, but how can we quantify training? And there's two variables that mainly quantify endurance training, and that is first, we have duration, and second, we have intensity. Now, duration is pretty easy to measure. We could use a watch, so it's 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 1 hour. Intensity is a bit more complex. We have, on one side, we have external intensity, and on the other side, we have internal intensity. So, external intensity is more about the objective power, for example, that we put out. So, 200 watts. Or when we're running a 5-minute kilometer pace. That's more about the objective side of what power output our body is doing physiologically. And then we have the internal side where it's more about how does that 200 watts on a cycle erg feel. So it will feel differently for you when you cycle 200 watts than compared to me. So the perception of that certain activity, of that certain intensity is what we call internal intensity. Okay, so now onto how can we train in the most effective way if we're doing an endurance sport. We can go and check what one, the pro athletes are doing, and two, what the scientific research for physiological exercise has been shown for like the past century. And what we see is that pro endurance athletes spend a lot of their training volume, so like a majority of their training blocks, in low intensity, like very easy. What means low intensity? Maybe if you're not using a heart rate or have any other fancy tools, just think about it that when you go on a run with your friend, with your mom, with your ex, I don't know, you should be able to talk. You should be able to have a conversation, like not non-stop, but it should feel quite comfortable to answer in full sentences. They spend a lot of their time in the low intensities and very, very little time in their very high intensities. So where it gets very, very hard getting to their max heart rate, max oxygen consumption, etc. This whole training approach, also maybe you've heard of it, it's called polarized training. So either one side or the lower side. And we try to avoid a lot of the accumulated training being in these middle intensities where it just kind of feels good. It's right around race pace, right around your threshold pace. And you feel like, yeah, I've trained, it was kind of hard, but I could do it. Now, let's talk about why. So the main reason why pro athletes, especially endurance athletes, are spending most of their time, most of their training volume in these low intensities is because the training is sustainable. Okay, so you can train consistently in these lower intensities without overtraining all of a sudden. Okay, you want to be able to train every day or every week or have your 5 sessions a week without having to stop, without feeling exhausted. And the main point of the polarized training is that we can find that balance between adaptive signals and systemic stress. You might ask yourself, so why? What are the kind of adaptations that you can hope for when you're doing continuous low intensity training? So number one, and most importantly, we have mitochondria. We're gonna have a higher density of mitochondria in our muscle tissues. Okay, so we all know it. The mitochondria are the powerhouse of our cell. And the higher density of mitochondria helps with aerobic respiration. So that means that we can generate energy with help of oxygen. So we can rely longer on aerobic sources to produce ATP, okay? And ATP is just, you can think of it about the energy currency that we have in our body. Second point, we're gonna have angiogenesis, so more blood vessels. That just means that we're gonna have a better blood flow through our muscle fibers. And the third point, which kind of ties together with point number 2, is that our heart will get stronger. We're gonna have left ventricular hypertrophy, which just means that our heart can increase the stroke volume that it can output. So it can output more blood into our systemic body. And with that, you should really spend your majority of the time in these lower intensities so you can build your aerobic base, your base for endurance sports. And then on top of that, like the rest of these 10% of your training volume should be spent at these very, very high intensities. Should be very hard, short intervals, like relatively short depending on what sport you do. And they will get you to breathe very hard. You can increase your VO2 max, your lactate threshold, your power during a certain movement, and you are going to die. They just hurt. You're gonna breathe like an elephant, believe me. But the good thing is that we're only going to spend about 10% of our whole training volume in these very high intensities, because as I said at the beginning, we want a good balance between adaptive signals and systemic stress. And that's again where that saying your fast is too slow and your slow is too fast comes into play. If you're that guy when you're always training somewhere in the middle, feels kind of hard, you're not quite sure if you can work out because you went quite hard but it was still sustainable, that's really where that saying comes into play. Really try to slow it down for the majority of the time, majority of your training volume, that it feels quite easy. We can accumulate a lot of training volume, we can accumulate a lot of miles, a lot of time in that specific activity, which will allow us to really build up that endurance base, because we want to endure activities for longer periods of time. So the whole principle of endurance. And then to even like to increase your performance in certain aspects, or to increase different physiological adaptations on top of that, like your 10%, they should be very hard, like really hard. For example, a typical VO2 max sessions for running or cycling could be 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off. So 3 minutes as fast as you can for that specific period of time, and then 3 minute very, very slow walking, for example, or very, very little watts if you're on a bike. Repeat that 3 to 4 times and you'll know what I mean if I say it should feel extremely hard. But that doesn't mean that you should never train in these middle intensities, okay? That middle intensity, as I said at the beginning, depending on what sport you're doing, that's often right around your threshold, so right around your race pace. You still want to practice that. You still want to train in these zones, but just not as much as most people do. As I said, majority of the time in low intensities, like your 10%, like your 80% here, your 10% in those very high intensities, and then maybe your 10% or people like pro athletes that go even lower in these middle intensities. So what I would suggest is simple. When a race comes up, when you have a competition, a few weeks out, you just start incorporating a bit more of that race pace into your training. Try to reduce a bit of that low intensity training, stay high with your high intensity training, like again, like the 5 to 10%, and then slowly increase the intensities in the middle. So you can get used to your race pace, you know how it feels, so you will be ready for race day. And last but not least, choose a sport that you like. Don't just go and start running because Karen said running is the best sport you could do, or don't just go swimming because your neighbors started swimming, okay? So really try to choose something that you enjoy, so you like going to train, you're looking forward to your training sessions, and then you'll also be able to sustain that. You'll feel motivated to go out and train. So now just a quick recap, a few take-home messages and a few practical adaptations. So first, what we just said at the end, choose a sport that you like. If you like the sport, you'll feel way easier to accumulate training volume. Secondly, just try to focus your endurance training a bit more on that polarized training method approach. Spending the majority of your time, so 80 to 85% at these low intensities, and then 5 to 10% at those very high intensities, just so you'll be able to reduce the accumulated training volume right in the middle, where the price that your body has to pay for the physiological adaptations that happen in your body, it's just not worth the price that your body has to pay. So if you liked that video, just give it a quick thumbs up and consider subscribing. If you have any other questions, just let me know in the comments down below. Stay healthy and happy. I wish you all a good day.